There's a type of absence that doesn't make noise. It doesn't slam doors, doesn't create scandals, doesn't leave long messages, doesn't try to convince anyone of anything. It just withdraws. And it's curious how, at first, people confuse this withdrawal with weakness. They think you accepted it, that you got over it too fast, that you didn't care that much. But time has a silent way of debunking arrogances. It doesn't argue, it reveals. And when it reveals, it's usually too late. Because there's a regret that doesn't arise at the moment of loss, but at the moment when life demands the absence. It's not when you leave that the penny drops. It's when routine weighs heavy, when the other's mask falls, when the world stops being welcoming and the person realizes with a certain intimate shame that there was someone there who held up more than it seemed. Maybe you know this script from the inside. You were the one who held the vibe, who swallowed the snarky reply to avoid a fight, who preferred to explain instead of humiliate, who had patience with the other's immaturity, with the bad mood, with the emotional confusion that the other called their way. You were the point of balance, and for that very reason you became invisible. Because balance, when it works, rarely gets applause. It's only noticed when it's missing. And then the most predictable human phenomenon happens. The other gets used to your greatness as if it were a given right, starts testing limits, brushes it off, pushes. And since you don't react with a spectacle, they interpret your serenity as permission. Respect, when not cultivated, becomes worn-out habit. Gratitude, when not practiced, becomes amnesia. And love, when it doesn't mature, becomes demand. Stoicism calls this by the simplest and harshest name: ignorance about what matters. For the Stoics, many people don't lose the essential out of malice. They lose it out of lack of clarity, for living as if good things were guaranteed, as if presence were eternal, as if care were automatic, as if character were common. Life, however, is a teacher who doesn't give warnings before the test. It just applies it. That's why this video isn't about getting payback. It's not about manipulating someone's regret, nor about teaching strategies to provoke missing. That would be staying trapped in the same emotional dependency, just with a more sophisticated packaging. What we're going to talk about here is different, and precisely because of that, it's powerful. We're going to talk about 7 stoic, silent, almost invisible ways that make people regret losing you. Not because you become cruel, not because you turn to stone, but because you become whole. And when someone loses a whole person, they don't just miss the company, they miss structure, they miss direction. They miss someone who, without realizing it, helped keep life in order. There's a detail that almost no one understands. Well-placed silence weighs more than any argument. The absence of reaction is, many times, more frightening than an explosive reaction. Because the explosion still proves you're stuck in the game. Serenity doesn't. Serenity indicates that you've left. And leaving for real, leaving from the inside, is what makes the other wonder. What exactly did I lose? Here's a point that converses as much with Stoicism as with deep psychology. When you change, you mess with the other's shadow. In Jung's language, the shadow is what the person doesn't want to admit in themselves. Selfishness, need for control, fear of rejection, neediness disguised as pride, immaturity disguised as freedom. While you remain available, trying to talk, insisting, explaining, enduring, the other's shadow stays comfortable. It doesn't need to look in the mirror. After all, there's always someone to cushion the consequences. But when you withdraw with dignity, without drama and without hate, you leave the person alone with their own reflection. And that's where regret is born. Because regret, deep down, is the late encounter with truth. Maybe you're tired of relationships where you have to beg for the basics: respect, presence, reciprocity. Tired of being strong all the time, understanding all the time, being the mature part of the story. And maybe there's a part of you, that part you've silenced for years, that wants something simple: peace. Not the peace of indifference, but the peace of someone who doesn't need to prove anything. The peace of someone who stops begging for recognition and starts living from a higher place. Stoicism doesn't promise that this will be comfortable. It promises that it will be real. It teaches that you don't control people's behavior, but you control your posture toward them. You don't control what they do with your presence, but you control what you do with your energy. And when you decide not to waste energy anymore in places where it's treated as leftover, something changes. First in you, then around you. And notice, we're talking about silent ways. That's important. Because the world is full of noisy people. People who announce, threaten, expose, make a point of saying, "Now you'll see." But noise is, many times, the last resort of those who lack firmness. Noise tries to impose. Silence, when born from conviction, just establishes. The person who really learns to respect themselves doesn't need to convince anyone of their value. They don't need to make speeches. They don't need to make indirects. They don't need to prove they're okay. They get okay, and that's it. And this posture has an inevitable psychological effect. It disorganizes those who fed off your predictability, because there was an old you who always came back, always explained, always gave in. When that old you dies, the other loses the map. And being without a map in front of themselves is terrifying. That's why, throughout this video, we're going to walk through 7 attitudes that don't depend on the other's reaction. They're not social tricks. They're internal choices. They're ways to conduct your own life with respect, temperance, courage, and clarity, the central virtues of Stoicism. And while you live like this, the natural consequence is that people who underestimated you start to miss you. Not you as an effective object, but you as a rare presence. And here's a question that cuts deep. Are you trying to be loved by people who only know how to love when they lose? Because there are people who only recognize value after the advantage ends. People who only call it missing what is actually loss of control. And discerning that is maturity. It's the difference between going back to the same prison and moving forward with your soul intact. You might be thinking, but I don't want anyone to regret. I just wanted them to have valued before. And that phrase says a lot about you. It reveals that your nature isn't vengeful. It's just, you wanted reciprocity. You wanted care to be two-way. You wanted affection not to be a contract where you always pay and the other always receives. And when that doesn't happen, what hurts isn't just the end. It's the feeling of having been obvious and still ignored. Stoicism, however, offers an elegant way out. You stop arguing with reality. You accept what is. Accept that some people only mature through loss. Accept that life is selective. Accept that not everyone is ready for the stability you offer. And instead of turning that into cynicism, you turn it into criterion. You become more careful with who has access to you. You learn to give without abandoning yourself. Learn to love without diminishing yourself. Learn to remain human without becoming naive. And that, silently, changes everything. Because when you become someone who doesn't beg, doesn't chase, doesn't humiliate themselves, and doesn't get revenge, but also doesn't give themselves away for free, you become unforgettable. You don't become hard to get. You become solid. And solidity is rare in a world of reactive, needy, and rushed people. So breathe. Let this introduction settle. What comes next isn't a manual to cause impact. It's a path to recover emotional dignity. And as an inevitable side effect, many people, especially those who treated you as replaceable, will discover too late that you weren't common. There's a moment when life asks for an internal decision, not a speech. It's not time to explain for the 10th time what you deserve. It's not time to try to be understood by those who only listen when it suits them. It's time to do something rarer, retreat with dignity. And in Stoicism, retreating isn't running away. It's choosing where your soul won't be negotiated. The first silent way is this: you withdraw your emotional consent. It seems simple, but it's a deep change. Before, you engaged in every provocation, every micro-disrespect, every weird vibe. You tried to solve everything with words. You tried to save the relationship from its own immaturity. A Stoic realizes that there are conversations that aren't conversations. They're traps. It's not about reaching an understanding, but about dragging you into chaos, into reaction, into imbalance. And when you stop entering that game, the person feels, even without understanding, that they lost a type of access. Withdrawing emotional consent is stopping to deliver your energy as if it were an obligation. It's not explaining too much. It's not justifying yourself in the face of childish accusations. It's not offering your heart as currency to get the minimum. You remain polite, remain human, but stop being available for drama. And that creates a void. Because many people don't miss your love. They miss your automatic yes, your infinite patience, your effort to fix what you didn't break. At first, this change is usually interpreted as coldness. And that's where the irony lies. They call coldness what is actually self-control. They call distance what is maturity. For the Stoic, you don't need to prove warmth where there's disrespect. Warmth, when it turns into submission, isn't virtue. It's loss of self. And in deep psychology, this messes with the other's shadow. Because when you don't react, when you don't rush to explain, the person is faced with their own behavior without your emotional cushion. They realize that the power to disorganize you has diminished, and those who fed off your imbalance start to feel a hard-to-name restlessness. Think of an everyday example. Someone throws a dig, a veiled criticism, something meant to put you down as a joke. The old you might respond with nervousness or try to talk right there, or spend hours ruminating on it inside. The new you just looks, registers, and doesn't buy the provocation. Maybe changes the subject. Maybe ends the interaction early. Maybe treats it with the same neutrality you'd give a passing cloud. That's Stoic. You choose not to be dragged by what doesn't add value. And when you do that consistently, the other realizes too late that they lost the privilege of affecting you with little. The second silent way is even stronger. You establish boundaries and enforce them without threats. That without threats is the detail that changes everything. Most people say, if you do that, I'm leaving. But don't leave. Say, I don't accept this, but accept it again. Say, it's the last time, and offer infinite last times. Over time, the other learns that your words are just noise, and the relationship becomes a ground where lack of consequence becomes the rule. The Stoic doesn't shout boundaries. He lives boundaries. He understands the difference between asking and deciding. Asking is putting your peace in the other's hand. Deciding is putting your peace in your own hand. So the Stoic boundary appears as a change of course. You don't argue for hours anymore. You end the conversation when it turns disrespectful. You don't insist on reciprocity. You pull back when you notice absence. You don't stay available for crumbs. You reorganize your time, your schedule, and your affections. And it's curious how this affects the other's regret. Because regret often arises when the person realizes you weren't an eternal presence. You were a choice. And now it's you who chooses not to be. Not for revenge, for lucidity. The person realizes that the feeling of, I can do anything and he will still be here, was an illusion fed by your tolerance. When you withdraw that tolerance, not with scandal, but with firmness, the other feels the loss as a reality shock. In the Jungian lens, boundaries awaken something important. They confront the other's childish part. That part that wants everything now, without cost, without responsibility. And when the boundary appears, that childish part might react with anger, irony, blackmail, victimhood. It's a test. And here the Stoic posture is decisive. You don't explain yourself to manipulation. You don't negotiate with disrespect. You don't try to be the good person at the cost of betraying yourself. You stay upright without aggression, without spectacle. And that's devastating for those who are used to moving you like an emotional piece. The third silent way is the rarest, and for that reason, the most striking. You cultivate serenity in the face of provocation and learn not to defend yourself from everything. There's a difference between positioning yourself and defending yourself. Positioning is speaking when necessary, with clarity and truth. Defending is living as if the other's judgment were a permanent court. The Stoic realizes that reputation is an unstable field. Integrity isn't. So he chooses integrity. There are people who provoke not because they're right, but because they want reaction. They want to see you lose your center. They want to feel they still control your vibe. And the Stoic, when mature, understands that the best response to certain provocations is to offer no response at all. Not out of fear, but out of soul economy. He knows that tranquility is too high a good to be traded for a useless argument. This doesn't mean turning passive. It means choosing battles that deserve your energy. It means not turning every friction into war. It means realizing that a lot of what irritates you isn't a real threat. It's bait. And when you stop biting the bait, something happens. You become unpredictable to those who only knew how to deal with you when you reacted. The other starts to miss the weak spot that used to be easy to push. And then a restlessness arises. Why can't I reach this person anymore? This serenity has a very concrete Stoic source. The dichotomy of control. You control your choices, your words, your attitudes, your boundaries. You don't control the other's mood, the other's maturity, the other's character. When you really accept this, you stop begging for transformation. And this stop begging changes the entire atmosphere. Because begging, even in a polite tone, carries a hidden message. You have the power to decide if I deserve peace. The Stoic cuts that message at the root. He decides for himself. And that, silently, makes him more respectable. Think of a simple scene. Someone tries to put you down in public, insinuating that you're too sensitive, too complicated, too difficult. The old you might try to justify, explain your side, prove it's not that. The new you doesn't need to prove. You keep your posture. Maybe say a few words without heat. I got it. And change the subject. Or simply walk away. And this absence of drama is, paradoxically, what marks the other's memory. Because deep down the provocation expected spectacle. And you offered silence with dignity. And it's at this point that regret starts to form, even if not yet admitted. Because the person walks away with the impression that they didn't hit you.
And those who need to hit the other to feel big feel small when they fail. Later, when life squeezes and there's no balanced person around, the memory comes back. I had someone who didn't sell out. I had someone who didn't need to dominate me. I had someone who was whole. Only now the door isn't open the same way. These three silent ways don't depend on the other. They depend on you. And that's why they're so transformative. You stop being hostage to the other's behavior.
You stop measuring your value by what the other offers. You return to the only place where freedom is real, your own conscience. There's a change that happens inside you before it happens outside. Almost no one notices at the time because it doesn't come with announcement, nor with final phrase, nor with drama. It comes as a lucid tiredness. One day you simply look at certain patterns and understand, if I stay here the same way, I'll lose myself. And that understanding, when true, doesn't turn into a fight. It turns into movement. The fourth silent Stoic way that makes people regret losing you is this. You stop offering presents where there's no reciprocity, and don't go back to check if now they value it. That's the point that hurts the other, because many people hold power not by what they do, but by what they know they can do, and still you'll remain. When you withdraw that guarantee, the game changes. In everyday life, this appears in simple, almost invisible gestures. You stop being the first to send a message. You stop insisting to see. You don't make more effort to keep the conversation alive. You don't put yourself as an option available anytime. And notice, this isn't a game of indifference. It's emotional hygiene. It's your spirit saying, I'm not going to feed alone something that needs to. Stoicism calls this temperance, the ability not to exceed, not to pour out, not to abandon yourself to buy affection. And that's where regret starts to ferment. At first, the person thinks you're just busy, then realizes you're distant. Next, tries a superficial contact, expecting you to go back to the old place. Only you don't go back. Not out of pride, but out of learning. Absence, when firm, forces the other to deal with an uncomfortable truth. Maybe you stopped explaining because you finally understood yourself. In the Jungian lens, this movement cuts an essential food for certain dynamics. The savior energy. There are people who, consciously or not, get used to having someone who balances them, forgives them, rescues them from their own consequences. You become the cushion, become the emotional translator, Become the adult in the room. And when you leave that role, the other is faced with their own disorder. Life gets noisier. And it's in that noise that real missing arises, not of your company, but of your organizing impact. The fifth silent way is even stronger. You replace the impulse to be right with the commitment to have peace. That's a maturity leap that few make. Because being right is sometimes an emotional drug. It's nice to prove, explain, show the facts, win the argument, corner the other with arguments. But the Stoic asks, does my life improve with this? And many times the answer is no. So you learn to drop certain disputes, not out of inferiority, but out of intelligence. You understand that there are people who don't want to understand. They want to win. And entering that arena is hurting yourself for sport. The Stoic chooses something else, internal clarity. He knows who he is, knows what he did, knows what he tried, and realizes he doesn't need the other's verdict to exist with dignity. And see how this messes with regret. When you stop arguing, the person loses the chance to turn everything into noise. Some people like long conversations not to resolve, but to dilute responsibility, to confuse, to tire, to make you doubt yourself. When you don't enter that anymore, the person is left without a stage. And without a stage, only raw reality remains. And reality is usually heavy for those who live off justifications. In day-to-day, this is simple and radical. You don't respond immediately to provocations. You don't accept endless debates by message. You don't try to convince someone to respect you. You don't make a trial of the past. You make choices in the present. And this posture is silent but creates an inevitable psychological effect. The person starts to realize you're no longer available to be spent. And then a confusion arises inside them. Why can't I pull this person into chaos anymore? That question, even if never said, is the start of regret. Because the other realizes they lost the power to put you on alert. And when someone loses power, they often realize the relationship was sustained more by control than by love. The sixth silent way is the one that, without saying anything, redefines the story. You truly improve, not to show, but to live. That's the highest form of response that exists because it's not a response. It's a consequence of growth. You start sleeping better, taking care of your body, organizing finances, studying, strengthening healthy friendships, investing in work, going back to hobbies you abandoned, rebuilding your life calmly without rushing to prove anything. And when you truly improve, something curious happens. Your energy changes. You no longer carry the vibration of someone asking for a place. You carry the vibration of someone who already has a place within themselves. And that bothers those who knew you dependent on the bond. It bothers because it reveals a truth. Maybe the relationship was a center of gravity pulling you down, and now you're lighter. Stoicism calls this excellence of character in action. It's not ostentation, it's discipline, it's virtue applied. You stop living reactively, like someone chasing what's missing, and start living like someone who builds. The person who lost you looks from afar and tries to understand, how did she manage to move on? And that question has two possible internal answers. The first is bitter, because I wasn't as essential as I imagined. The second is more painful, because I was essential but I didn't know how to care. In Jungian psychology, your growth activates the other's shadow by contrast. It's not that you're showing, it's that your life starts working better without that dynamic. And the other's unconscious perceives this as loss of influence. The person might even try to disqualify. Now they're full of themselves. Now they've become someone else. Now they're different. But the subtext is, I no longer have access to what I had. And that over time turns into regret. Here it's important to note a Stoic subtlety. You don't grow with anger. You grow with direction. Anger still keeps an invisible cord. Direction cuts that cord. Growing to prove something is still living for the other. Growing to live well is returning to yourself. And it's precisely this, returning to yourself, that makes the loss evident to those who underestimated you. Notice how, in these three ways, you didn't need to attack anyone, didn't need to expose anyone, didn't need to win any argument. You just stopped abandoning yourself and started governing yourself. And that's perhaps the highest form of human power: internal governance. When you govern yourself, you become less manipulable, less predictable, less needy for validation. And the person who lost you starts to realize they lost something rare. Someone who brought stability, presence, coherence, and who now isn't available to be treated as a certainty. The seventh way is the most silent of all because it doesn't happen on the relationship stage. It happens inside, where no one applauds, no one argues, no one interferes. It's when you do something that changes the entire geometry of the story. You stop needing the other's recognition to close the cycle. You close the door from the inside and don't leave the key outside. That's pure Stoicism. Because for a Stoic, there's no true freedom while you depend on something you don't control. And the other's validation is perhaps one of the most dangerous dependencies. It disguises prison as hope. You tell yourself you just want to clear things up, finish with maturity, be understood. But deep down there's a part of you waiting for a specific phrase that returns dignity to what you lived. As if your pain needed to be recognized to be legitimate. As if the value of your effort depended on the other's stamp. And there's the point. When you need that, you stay trapped. The person can ignore you and you get restless, can give crumbs and you get excited, can give a cold response and you fall. You become hostage to the other's mood, the other's timing, the other's confusion. And no matter how much you say you've moved on, there's a part of you still on sentry, waiting for the moment when the other's penny will drop. Only that moment, when it comes, rarely comes the way our imagination wants. Sometimes it never comes. And insisting on it is postponing your own life. Then comes the day when you do the most adult thing. You accept that not every story ends with justice. Not every person matures. Not every apology arrives. And you decide that, even so, you won't carry this weight anymore. You don't erase what you lived. You don't pretend it didn't hurt. You just change internal place. Instead of living in the expectation of settling scores, you start living in your own conscience. You look back and know, with serenity, what was true in you. And that's enough. In Jungian psychology, this is like withdrawing a projection. For a long time, the psyche tries to get from the other a confirmation that in truth is internal work, the confirmation that you have value even when not chosen, that you have dignity even when not recognized, that you can be a good human without being rewarded for it. When you make this movement, the energy changes. Your field changes. You become less accessible to the emotional pull. And that's where, paradoxically, the person perceives the loss with more force. Because while you still try to talk, adjust, insist, the person feels there's a way back. Might not come back now, but there is. There's an extended rope. There's a loose end. There's access. Only when you close from the inside, without making a fuss, without announcing, without threatening, the person starts to feel something strange. The access was cut. They might even try a casual contact, a light message, a "hey stranger," an emotional bait disguised as kindness. And then they realize they no longer find the same place in you. They don't find the same anxiety. They don't find the same availability. They don't find that almost coming back, almost giving in, almost explaining. It's as if you've become more sober inside, and that for those who treated you as a certainty is disconcerting. True regret is born when the person understands you're no longer leaving. You already left. But not with anger, with lucidity. And that doesn't give a fight, doesn't give easy reversal, doesn't give a victim narrative, doesn't give a way to paint you as the villain because you didn't make a scandal. You just stopped putting yourself at the disposal of what hurt you. In the end, almost everything boils down to a simple question, but one many avoid out of fear of the answer. Who did you become when you stopped begging? Because there's a point where pain stops being just pain and turns into clarity. Loss stops being just loss and turns into selection. And silence stops being empty and turns into presence. Presence in you. The Stoic ways we went through here have something in common. None of them was made to make the other suffer. They were made for you to stop suffering the wrong way. The wrong way is suffering trying to control the uncontrollable. It's suffering trying to educate those who don't want to mature. It's suffering trying to buy reciprocity with infinite patience. It's suffering arguing with reality as if reality were obligated to be fair. Stoicism offers another dignity, the dignity of accepting what is, without bowing to what's unworthy. When you withdraw emotional consent for drama, you're not punishing anyone, you're protecting your own peace. When you establish boundaries and enforce without threats, you stop negotiating dignity and start practicing it. When you choose serenity in the face of provocation, you become someone who can't be governed by others' impulses. When you stop offering presents where there's no reciprocity, you return responsibility to those who always lived comfortably with your effort. When you trade the eagerness to be right for the commitment to have peace, you detach from the addiction of arguing with those who don't want to understand. When you truly improve, without showing off, you rebuild a life that doesn't depend on those who underestimated you. And when you close the cycle from the inside, you become free, and freedom is a type of strength that most people only recognize when they lose it. Maybe while you're listening to this, there's a part of you wanting to say, "But I wanted them to have seen before." And that's human. But there's a point where maturity trades that phrase for another. "I see now." Because when you see, you don't need to convince anyone anymore. You become guardian of your own energy, and start choosing relationships that don't depend on your sacrifice to work. Time is a silent judge. It doesn't shout, doesn't accuse, doesn't humiliate. It just puts each person in front of the consequences of their own character. And when someone loses a person who had character, not perfection, but character, life gets harder in a way that doesn't show on the first day. It shows later. On the day when there was no one to support without humiliating. On the day when there was no one to talk without destroying. On the day when there was no one to love without controlling. There's a type of strength that doesn't have a closed face. It has a clean gaze. It doesn't feed off the other. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need to win. It just needs to remain faithful to what it knows is true. That strength is silent. And that's why it's so feared. It can't be manipulated with guilt, nor with neediness, nor with provocation. And I want to leave you with an image. Imagine your life is a house. For a long time, you left the door open for those who entered with mud on their feet, without caring about the floor. You cleaned. You fixed. You pretended it didn't bother. Now you don't need to kick anyone out with shouts. You just learn to close the door, and learn, above all, to choose who gets the key. That doesn't make you worse. It makes you responsible for yourself. If some person regrets having lost you, that's their business. Your business is another. It's building a life where you don't need to be less to be accepted. A life where you don't need to explain to have respect. A life where you don't need to bleed to prove you love. If this video put order into something you've been feeling in silence, write in the comments, "I choose peace." I read and respond when possible. If you want to support the channel, like this video, share with someone who needs to strengthen their own boundaries, and subscribe to receive more content on Stoicism and emotional maturity.